For as far back as I can remember, a vacation to the Blue Ridge Mountains was an annual ritual for my family and me. We had this cozy cabin nestled in the wooded hollows, which had been passed down for generations. If I close my eyes, I can conjure up its well-worn, pine-scented interior as if it were yesterday. It was a wonderful tradition that I kept up even once I was well into adulthood. My family's cabin was a sturdy structure of pine and stone built by my grandfather's gnarled hands. It nestled there, a modest hermitage hidden away from the world's prying eyes. Not a luxury resort, sure, but it was a haven all the same, my solitary retreat. Made all the more comforting due to the memories of the years spent there. The drive to the cabin was a part of the tradition itself, and usually I relished it, even if it was over 8 hours of driving interstates, followed by narrow, winding mountain roads. This year was different, though. This year I had decided to take a different route. My reasons were twofold. First, I had a distinct need for adventure, for change. Second, and probably most importantly, my rust bucket of a car was in its twilight years. Each mile was a test of endurance for it. The check engine light had flickered like a dying candle for most of the past 3 weeks. I figured that the less strain I put on it, the better. So I gambled with the faster route dictated by my also ancient half-broken GPS. I hadn't really used it in years, opting instead to use my cell phone. But up in the mountains, cell service is about as reliable as a politician's promise. The signal bars on my phone danced, appearing and disappearing with each turn in the road. Like smoke, always there but never quite graspable. Text messages would go unsent, calls would drop. So I was stuck with the GPS. The lack of cell service also meant that my only hope for entertainment was the car radio. The car's radio was an antique. No slick Bluetooth connection, no aux input. Just the basic AM/FM setup that had entertained the generations. As I drove, I fiddled with the tuner, the frequencies whining and croaking like spectral voices. Eventually, I settled on the station with the least static, a classic rock station. I had started out for the cabin after work. So, by the time I reached the mountains and began winding my way into them, it was already dark. Just as I was sinking into the dangerously comfortable lull of highway hypnosis, a voice cut through the static of the radio, sharp and urgent. It seemed to shatter the warm nostalgia of the old rock anthem. "Attention, drivers." It blared, a layer of distortion making the voice sound unnaturally tinny. I instinctively turned the volume knob. "Rockslide reported on Mount Serpent Road. Detour advised. Kindly divert to Black Hollow Road for a safer route." I blinked, startled. Mountain Serpent Road was my route, but I had never heard of Black Hollow Road. I traced these roads in my mind, puzzled. My memory, dotted with overheard stories at local diners and crumpled up maps, yielded no route by that name. The advice from the radio announcement, combined with my cursory knowledge of the local geography, didn't quite add up. The voice, the unfamiliar detour, it felt off. And yet, rock slides weren't anything to mess around with. I grappled with the decision, feeling a weird knot in my stomach. Yet I couldn't deny the danger of a rock slide. I knew they did happen around here. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. The warning seemed urgent. I knew this area, not like the back of my hand, but enough to recall the names and the layout of the countless road maps that I had studied. Black Hollow Road. Maybe it was a new road, I reasoned. Or maybe a local name, one of those unofficial titles that locals assign to their shortcuts, seldom known by the seasonal vacationers. I glanced at my phone. No signal, of course. No way to verify the information. Black Hollow Road, I muttered, glancing at the GPS. It had the road, a turnoff just up ahead. My foot eased off the gas, considering the change. The car grumbled in response as I slowed down, as if it shared my uncertainty. It was decision time. I could ignore the radio warning, carry on along Mountain Serpent, and perhaps get buried under a heap of rocks, or I could take a chance with the unknown. I sighed. All right, I muttered. A habit of talking to my car always made the journey less lonesome. Black Hollow Road it is. It looks like we're taking a detour. The warning blared from the radio again, like an unwelcome ghost refusing to rest. Black Hollow Road. The name echoed in the car, bouncing off the grimy windows and worn upholstery. It whispered in my ear. An eerie mantra that sent an unsettling shiver down my spine. I saw a sign showing a turnoff for Black Hollow Road, and I took it. The road was immediately rougher and less maintained than the route that I had just left. Welcome to Black Hollow Road, I muttered with a chuckle, only half amused. As the car eased onto the detour, the world outside seemed to shift subtly. A gust of wind ruffled through the towering trees, sending a shudder through the leaves as if the mountain itself was whispering a warning. The gnarled trees seemed to lean over the road, whispering amongst themselves, like spectators at a spectacle. It was an eerie sight, straight out of a horror flick. The winding mountain road led me straight to the edge of a small, forlorn town that seemed to have been forgotten by time. A small, isolated speck of civilization tucked away within the Blue Ridge Mountains. The street was eerily quiet, lined with derelict buildings, shops with dusty windows, a vacant-looking school, restaurants that had long since served their last meals. Amid the deserted townscape, only one building appeared to still have life in it, a rundown gas station. The gas station's neon sign flickering in the encroaching twilight proclaimed it open 24/7. My car groaned, sputtering, but it held on. The little engine that could. I drove onward through the town for a few minutes, until the road, much like my peace of mind, abruptly ended. A dead end. I looked at the GPS. Its screen a blank slate, no trace of the town's skeletal grid. The GPS was as lost as I was. I reached for my phone, hoping against hope that Google Maps might offer salvation. But the mountains continued to wreak havoc on the signal. Not a bar of reception. The silence of the town wrapped itself around me, more chilling than the night mountain air. Yet there was a twisted sense of humor in all of this. A modern-day traveler held hostage by his dependence on gadgets. There I was, stuck in a creepy town with an obstinate car and a GPS that had no clue where it was. A phone that couldn't reach out to the rest of the world. This was gonna be a great dinner party anecdote. If I made it to a dinner party again. A heavy sigh escaped me. And so, with no other option, I turned the car around, heading back towards the only sign of life that I had seen since taking the detour, the gas station. The desolate town looked sinister in the dim glow of my headlights, which cast creeping shadows that danced on the ghostly facades. The abandoned schoolyard was eerily silent, swings moving gently in the breeze, creaking an ominous tune. The storefronts seemed to leer at me from the darkness, their vacant windows like blind eyes. My skin prickled, the nape of my neck tingled. The feeling of being watched intensified. Everything looked like a scene from one of those post-apocalyptic movies, except that the apocalypse seemed to have made an exception for the lone gas station. Rolling into the station, I parked alongside the pumps. I decided to fill up the tanks. The pumps were ancient, their rusted bodies refusing to acknowledge the existence of credit cards. It looked like I'd have to pay cash inside. As I pumped the gas, the hair on my arms stood on end and a prickling sensation ran down my spine. It felt as if unseen eyes were prying, peeling back the veneer of my bravado. I tightened my grip on the pump handle. I was being watched. I could feel it. Shaking off the eerie sensation, I walked to the gas station. As I pushed open the door to the station's interior, it was like stepping into a grubby time capsule. The store was a relic from a bygone era. Grimy, barely stocked shelves were placed in uneven rows, most items hidden under a fine layer of dust. The linoleum floor was sticky underfoot. The air hung heavy with the smell of stale coffee and old engine oil. An off-kilter ceiling fan fighting a losing battle against the stifling air. I grabbed a bag of Lay's from a dusty rack, its crinkly sound echoing eerily in the silent store. There's a certain comforting consistency about potato chips, something unchanging and steady, even in the midst of a weird, desolate town. I clutched the bag a little tighter than necessary, as if hoping that the mundane could anchor me in this increasingly unsettling reality. I was about to call out to get the attention of the station attendant when he emerged from a back room. He had the look of a man who had seen better days. Gaunt and pallid, he had a pair of watery eyes that glimmered with a peculiar intensity. There was something familiar about him, not in a friendly neighbor sort of way, but more like a déjà vu moment that sends a chill down your spine. Like he had been an extra in every horror movie that I had ever seen. I laid the bag of chips on the counter with my cash in hand. He just stared at me and said nothing. "Hi, just the chips and the gas," I said to break the uncomfortable silence. He stared at me unblinkingly for a few more seconds, then began to ring up the purchase. He slid the chips and my change back across the counter and continued to stare. He still hadn't said a word. And now that I think about it, I don't think that he blinked during the entire encounter. I was taking the detour. How do I continue from here?" I asked. This road, it just dead ends." He continued with his intense stare for a long, uncomfortable moment before finally speaking in a voice that sounded like gravel being dragged across metal. The conversation that ensued was jarring. Actually describing it as a conversation might be a little generous. The directions were convoluted, a series of turns and landmarks. "Go down the road 3 blocks, then take the left. You'll see 2 big cottonwoods. keep going about half a mile. Now take that left turn right after the big elm. You'll keep going straight through town. Then you'll see the old logging road. You'll know it when you see it. Turn right on it. It'll get you to the other side." Then he nodded, his gaze never leaving mine. That was it. No drive safe or watch out for wildlife or anything. Just confusing directions delivered with an unsettling flatness, as if he'd recited them 1,000 times. The air between us thickened, filled with an odd sense of dread that didn't fit into the confines of the cramped station. There was something off about the guy, that much was clear. Maybe the guy was riding some kind of high or had a medical condition. As soon as I thought that, I felt bad for being so judgmental. The guy seemed to be the only person left in this town. Asking him to clear up the foggy instructions felt as promising as expecting a solid answer from a magic 8-ball. So I did what seemed sensible. "I appreciate it," I muttered. I scooped up the bag of chips and my change. The coins were cold and clammy against my hand. The door creaked its farewell as I stepped out into the night, my heart pounding. The situation had completely unnerved me. I hurried as fear propelled me towards my car. Nervousness prickled my skin, spider legs of fear making me glance around with the furtiveness of a rabbit stalked by a fox. Halfway to my car, something primal, something deeply wired in my brain told me to look back, and when I did, the pit of my stomach went cold. The attendant was gone. More concerningly, the shop's lights had been turned off. The bright lights of the station had now dimmed to only a meager few, glowing with a sickly jaundiced color, just barely describable as a night light. That couldn't be right. The station should be aglow, ready for customers. If I hadn't just left it, I would have thought that the store had been closed for years. My heart kicked against my ribcage, insisting that something was wrong. An inkling of a thought wormed its way into my brain. Was the station meant to be closed? Had I gone in after it had closed? Maybe that was why the attendant had acted so odd. I cast my eyes upwards, catching the neon sign hanging ominously against the inky black sky. Its glow punctuated the night, a luminescent declaration that pierced the gloom. Gory reds and greens screamed the lie that the place was open 24/7. An electric contradiction to the now suddenly locked up dark station below. Something was wrong. A discordant note in an otherwise mundane symphony. And standing there under the haunted glow of that neon sign, I could feel it. A wrongness in the air that tasted of dread and unvoiced fears. A fresh wave of shivers rippled through me, caused by a fleeting thought. In a town devoid of life, I was not alone. And that realization suddenly wasn't comforting, not at all. As I got back into the car, the feeling of being watched clawed at me. I tried to shake it off. I cranked the engine. It protested, sputtered, and then, thankfully, roared back to life. The radio crackled back to life with an unusual melody, far from the tunes that it had been crooning earlier. No golden oldies, no rock anthems. Just an eerie mix of discordant notes and a singer who sounded more like he was lamenting than performing. The hairs on the back of my neck snapped to attention. I shoved a chip into my mouth, fingers fumbling to find another station. I flipped through the channels, seeking the refuge of familiar songs. But the only station that the radio could pick up was the one now playing the odd music. I turned off the radio. I sat there, munching on the chips, every crunch reverberating in the silence, trying to push down the feeling of unease. A thought of turning back brushed against my mind, but I shoved it away. I had already driven long enough. I was tired. I would just try to follow the directions, finish the detour, get to the cabin, and start my vacation. The silence was gnawing at me, an insistent, maddening itch in my brain. So I reached out and punched the button on the radio back on, hoping to drown it out. The odd music had been replaced by a classical piece. It was old, slow, and soothing. The melody coiling through the car like a friendly spirit. The tension in my shoulders eased a little. Much better. This station was like an eccentric curator's exhibit, its offerings swinging from one extreme to the next, a buffet of disparate sounds and genres. Eclectic, that's the word. Eccentric and eclectic. But right now, with Beethoven as my co-pilot and the comforting drone of the engine beneath me, I could almost feel that everything was normal. That I hadn't just walked out of a scene from a horror flick. Almost. As I drove off, following the maze-like directions as best I could remember, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The attendant stood there, by the gas pumps, his gaze boring into my retreating car. I popped another chip into my mouth. Strangeness heaped upon strangeness, I thought. I navigated the bewildering twists and turns of the town, trying to follow the puzzling instructions the old gas station attendant had given me. My car grinding to a halt at an intersection, the stop sign weathered and covered in rust. I squinted to make out the street names. Elm and King, I murmured, the words hanging in the quiet cab of the car. The names didn't mean anything to me. My headlights strained against the gloom, the beams dancing off the peeling paint that seemed to cover every building of the town. Every shop front was a sunken-eyed skull. Every weather-beaten house was a hunched figure draped in shadow. The song on the radio ended, and the same voice from the message about the rock slide and detour came on with a different message. Hello, folks. Just a friendly reminder about the Hollow Crest Summer Festival celebration tonight at the town center. Do come to join us for the grand celebration. A night of joy, a night of togetherness, a night to remember. Who throws a festival at midnight? I muttered under my breath. A festival? Now, in the dead of night. In an abandoned town. At least it seemed abandoned. It didn't make a lick of sense, but then what did in this town? I hadn't seen any life since leaving the gas station. The voice was inviting, the words filled with promise, but underneath, there was an undertone of what? A chill, foreboding. Maybe I was just projecting my own unease. My hands, slick with nervous sweat, tightened around the steering wheel. The shadows seemed to creep closer. The buildings loomed larger. The streets grew even more labyrinthine. It felt as if the town was closing in on me, like a beast preparing to swallow its prey. An easy listening song came on the radio. I sat in the darkness, only my headlights providing any illumination. I decided that it was best to get out of here as soon as possible. My knuckles blanched as I wrestled with the steering wheel, maneuvering the car along the serpentine network of roads, trying again to follow the odd directions. My mind kept drifting back to the radio message. The celebration, like everything else about this town, felt off, somehow unhinged. The directions themselves seemed to be useless. I wondered if the guy at the gas station had intentionally given me inaccurate directions. Maybe he just wasn't good at directions. Maybe my nerves had misremembered them. But they seemed to have no relation to the town. I slowed the car looking for any of the landmarks that the man had mentioned. My car shuddered as I pulled to a halt at a decrepit stop sign, the skeletal outlines of Maple Street and Pine Avenue barely legible on the moss-laden street signs. I squinted into the gloom, trying to match the cryptic directions to the shapeless shadow world outside my windshield. The road twisted ahead, disappearing into the darkness that blanketed the ghostly town. I was at a crossroads, literally and metaphorically. Across the intersection, an abandoned shop sat like a hollow-eyed skull, its glass eyes dark and empty. As I glanced into its depths, a shadow fluttered. A trick of the light, a loose curtain. I held my breath as I watched, waiting for the shadow to move again. It remained still. Suddenly, the radio's soft melody was rudely interrupted. "Folks, don't forget the town square is the place to be tonight. Fun, games, and more await you. Come join us." The voice, dripping with forced cheeriness, resumed its sales pitch. "And for those of you unsure of which way to go, make a left at Pine Avenue and you're almost there. The celebration awaits you." My fingers, already wide on the steering wheel, clenched tighter. A surge of electricity shot down my spine and my heart felt like it stopped for a second. Pine Avenue. I looked back up at the street sign, my mind racing. How did he know where I was? Was this a general announcement, or was this for me? The coincidence, the timing, it was too much, too creepy. It was impossible, it was ludicrous, it was terrifying. A cold dread crept down my spine. A haunting realization that even though it seemed like I was alone in the town, something knew where I was and was trying to guide me, drawing me into its web. The shadows seemed to grow darker, the silence heavier. My heart pounded in my chest like a wild drum as the terror that I had been wrestling with swelled into an overwhelming tide. The voice, the celebration, the town, even the events at the gas station, everything screamed at me to bolt. An icy fear trickled down my spine. The sooner I got out of here, the better. The words of the radio host echoed in my head. A party at the town square at midnight. Turn left. I shuddered. No thank you. This was my cue to leave before this night took a turn for the weirder, if it could do that. With a squeal of tires, I slammed my foot on the gas, ignoring the direction the voice had indicated. The town, its shadowy festival, and the too-knowing voice on the radio could keep their secrets. I was getting out of here. Forget the detour, I would go back. I would take my normal route. I just needed to get out of this town and back on the highway. Like a rat in a maze, I began to double back. I threaded my way back through the twisted arteries of the town. The night and my fear turning it into a grotesque labyrinth seemingly designed to confuse and disorient. Every junction seemed a mirror of the last. The same worn-out buildings, same decaying facades, same gloom, and the same bone-deep chill. Every darkened alleyway a potential hiding place, every scrap of movement in the corner of my vision a potential threat. And that was another unsettling thing. While the town was clearly abandoned, there seemed to be movement in the shadows. I was running in circles in a town that no longer felt merely desolate, but predatory. The sense of being watched was palpable, a spectral shiver tingling again at the back of my neck. Around me, the town stirred restlessly. In the corners of my eyes, I caught movement. A flicker here, a shift there. Shadows prowled the derelict storefronts, sulking in alleyways and appearing and disappearing with the fickle play of my car's headlights. Like phantoms, they seemed both there and not there, a chilling dance of ambiguity, coalescing on the periphery of my vision. I could almost feel the weight of unseen eyes on me, their gaze as tangible as the clumsy grip of dread squeezing my heart. In my rush to escape, I managed to get myself even more turned around than I was before. The more I drove, the more confused I became. I tried to find something that looked familiar, that might lead me out of this godforsaken town. The car sputtered ominously every so often, a morbid echo of my escalating fear. The atmosphere was thick with a chilling sense of dread. The radio continued its spectral performance. A haunting melody floated through the car, repeatedly sliced apart by the insistent voice, each time more urgent than the last.
Join us, the celebration awaits. Turn on Rhododendron Street,
Or,
left at Cherry Lane,
or,
right at Laurel Road.
it seemed as if every other street that I turned onto was promptly announced, with directions being given to guide me to the town center. It was like the town itself was aware of my every move. Desperate, I tried to ignore the voice, to drown out its insidious implications with the rational part of my mind. I wasn't very successful. A flicker of recognition kindled as I turned onto Oak Street. I felt like I'd been here before. I thought that I recognized a decaying billboard, a ghost of its former self with its advertisement so faded and peeled that I couldn't really make it out, but it looked familiar. I continued on. As I reached the next intersection, I looked both directions down the cross street. I noticed an old movie theater that I felt like I had passed on my way into town. I turned onto the road. As I passed by the theater, I again saw shadows move within the building. This time, I was almost certain that it wasn't my imagination. I reached the next intersection. The voice on the radio broke through the music again.
Don't be shy, turn right on Ivy Lane.
I looked up at the name of the cross street. Yep, Ivy Lane. In that moment, I didn't think that I could be any more afraid. I was wrong. Suddenly, the car sputtered, protesting in the darkness. My heart jumped into my throat. God, not now. Just then, the radio chirped up once more. The crackling voice broke through the music, this time sounding more like an actual ad. I paused to listen.
Car troubles got you down? If your ride's groaning and grumbling, then drag it down to King's Auto. Our wrenches are ready, our bays are open right now to heal all of your troubles. Located just off the town center. And hey, while you're waiting, you can enjoy our summer festival celebration. Now taking place in the town center. Join us. The celebration awaits.
As the ad ended, my blood ran cold. I had to get out of here. I continued down Oak Street. As I drove, shadowy movement captured my attention. A flicker of darkness between two buildings. I tensed, twisting my hands on the steering wheel. I reached the next intersection, and I didn't stop at the stop sign. I turned left. If I was correct, that should be the right direction. At the very least, it seemed to be heading away from the town center, which seemed like the place that I least wanted to be. As I drove down the street, I noticed a florist shop. The wilted flowers in the window were a welcome sight. I had seen it shortly after leaving the gas station. I knew where I was. Another right turn, then down 2 blocks, and a left turn, and I would be back on the road with the gas station. I was almost out. I drove faster, impatient to escape this hell. Again, I didn't pause at the stop sign. I took the right. As I completed the turn, the engine sputtered once again. A dry cough that sent ripples of fear skittering along my nerves. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise, an animalistic response to an unseen predator that stalked me from the shadows. I looked at the dashboard. None of the lights or gauges gave any sign of what the problem was. Hopefully, it was just the car's usual sputters. As I glanced back up at the road, the frail light of the car's headlights caught something odd in the middle of the road. It was a huddled shape that, as I drove closer, morphed into a terrifying reality. A woman. My foot slammed onto the brake pedal, my breath hitching in terror. The woman was sprawled in the middle of the road, bound and gagged. She thrashed weakly, her wild eyes pleaded for help. Panic crashed over me like a tidal wave, dragging me under its icy depths. A string of logical thoughts urged me to stay in the car, to keep driving. But there was another voice, a softer one that echoed in my conscience. I had to help the woman. Leaving the car engine running and unbuckling my seatbelt, I got ready. Against the screaming instinct of self-preservation, I threw the door open and I stepped out of the car. The cab light painted everything with a weak, ghostly glow. The radio continued broadcasting an eerie lullaby, echoing in the ominous silence of the town. With the car's protection discarded, I took hesitant steps towards the woman, my mind reeling, my heart pounding. With each step, the crunch of gravel echoed off the surrounding buildings. Suddenly, the crackling voice on the radio snapped me back to reality. The airy tones of the haunting music fell away. It was replaced by an unsettling baritone voice that seemed to dance in a chilling cadence. It was no longer a friendly invitation. It had transmuted into something darker. A litany, an unholy incantation. The voice now a commanding, hypnotic drone in a language that sounded different than any I had ever heard. I blinked, forcing my attention back to the woman. The sight of her stirred up a knot of terror in my gut, but I moved closer. One step, then another. But then a flicker caught my eye. My head jerked up, my heart pounding like a drum. From the dim recesses of the town, figures began to emerge. Not just one or two, but many, like some nightmarish congregation, shrouded in darkness. They emerged from behind the decrepit buildings, carrying candles, converging upon us. In a horrifying unity, the figures joined the radio in its diabolical song, their voices coiling around the radio's chant, the sound of it scraping against my sanity. I froze at the sight, not quite able to believe or process what was happening. Each of the figures held a candle, the tiny flames flickering against the encroaching darkness. Their lights danced on the crumbling facades of the buildings, casting long and eerie shadows that seemed to breathe with a life of their own. I spun around, the depth of my predicament crashing into me with a terrifying clarity. I was surrounded. The robed figures stood in a loose circle, ensnaring the woman, the car, and myself. They slowly but surely bore down on us, like a noose being tightened around my throat. Dread sent a shudder rolling down my spine. The woman's muffled screams knifed through the night air, drawing my attention back to her. I turned to see the woman's face contorted in terror. Her eyes were wide and glossy with tears that traced a wet trail down her cheeks. Though the tape covered her mouth, her scream was a helpless cry against the dark. Her eyes met mine, a silent plea amidst the fear. Her terror mirrored my own wide-eyed horror. I stood there, my heart hammering against my ribs. I couldn't leave her. Not like this. Not with them. Every instinct screamed at me to run away, to hide, to escape. That there was no chance that I could save her, that it was a trap. All of that was probably true. I glanced at the woman again. Her eyes met mine, terror and pleading reflected in the depths of her gaze. It was the desperate plea in her eyes that clinched it. I couldn't leave her. Not here, not like this. I had to at least try to save her. The radio voice and the figure's chants had become cacophonous. More fervent now, more insistent. The chant vibrated through the night, the syllables haunting and otherworldly. They echoed in my spinning head. The robed figures continued to slowly and steadily press in closer. I was running out of time. I had to move. Before I could second-guess myself, I surged forward. A desperate sprint, every muscle straining against the fear that clung to me. It was the fastest I had ever moved. Faster than I thought was even possible for me. I was desperate to reach her before the encroaching figures. No sooner had I bolted towards her, though, than the figures moved. They were quick, almost supernaturally so. They seemed to slide through the night, converging on the woman with a fluidity that belied their human form. I wasn't halfway to her, and a handful had already reached her. A wave of black robes that had swallowed her. I skidded to a halt, my gaze darting to the others that were heading straight for me. I wheeled around and sprinted back towards the car with everything I had. But they were on me in an instant, a figure appearing in my path right by the car door. I did the only thing I could. I lowered my shoulder and I charged into it. The figure stumbled backwards, reeling from the impact, and a sliver of grim satisfaction sliced through my terror. I threw myself into the car, slamming the door shut. Ignoring the shaking of my hands and the roaring in my ears, I threw the car into reverse, slamming it into two more robed figures behind me as I backed up. They thumped into the back of the car and rolled off. The twin thuds as they collided with the car reverberated through me. I winced at the sound, the grim reality of it forcing the bitter taste of fear further down my throat. This was real. The danger was real. There was no time for guilt, no time for anything but survival. I shifted into drive and I sped down the road, tires squealing against the desolate asphalt. The car shot forward. It slammed into another one of the figures. I wrenched the wheel to the side, veering onto the side street. The radio voice was now a demonic soundtrack, ranting in its lunatic fervor. Miraculously, the street that I had turned on was the main road that I had taken into town. As I flew down the road, the gas station emerged from the gloom. Its lights were now completely extinguished, looking as deserted as the rest of the town. But the attendant was still there, still by the pumps, exactly where he had been when I last saw him. As I hurtled past, he lifted a hand in a somber wave. The gesture so incongruous in the nightmare around me, it might have been a hallucination. My foot never left the gas. The car was a bullet flying down the road. The radio voice had gone silent, replaced by a static hiss that filled the car like spectral whispers. I kept driving, the road a blurry tunnel in the night. Then the radio crackled back to life one last time. The voice, as honeyed as ever, echoed through the silence.
You've been a great guest. Don't ever come back.
As if I needed the warning, I thought. The miles bled together as I drove. The image of the woman, her eyes filled with terror, her silent pleas for help, ricocheted inside my skull like some maddening echo. A gnawing urgency ate at me. I had to find a way to help her. She was clearly in danger, I was certain of it. I grabbed my phone from the console, hoping to call 911 or send a text, something. But of course, the phone spat back the hateful words, "No service." I lobbed the useless device into the passenger seat. A few minutes later, a glimmer of relief washed over me as, on the horizon, the muted glow of a gas station came into view. Several cars were clustered around the pumps. Someone was pumping gas, a comforting sign of life. An 18-wheeler rested at the far end of the parking lot. The driver leaned against the cab, having a smoke. The normality of it seemed alien, a stark contrast to the nightmare I had just fled from. I pulled in slowly and parked by the store. I took a deep, steadying breath before I shouldered open the door to the gas station. Inside, the fluorescent lights cast a sterile glow over the snack-filled shelves and glossy countertops. The clerk, a disinterested guy, maybe early 20s, looked up from a magazine as I came in, offering me a non-committal nod. The place smelled of stale coffee, hot dogs on a roller grill, and a faint undertone of gasoline. "Hey," I started, my voice shaky. I need your help." His brows lifted, intrigued or wary, I couldn't tell. I launched into the story then. The details tumbled out in a rush. I told him about the town, the woman, the robed figures. The words came out in broken fragments, veering towards incoherence at times. It was like trying to transcribe a nightmare, every detail sounding more absurd than the last. The store clerk didn't interrupt, he didn't express disbelief. When I finally ran out of breath, he calmly reached for the phone. "I'll call the police, they can sort this out," he said, already dialing. Then he gave me a cup of coffee and I took a seat and I waited for them to arrive. The two highway patrol officers that arrived some 20 minutes later exuded an air of calm, seasoned authority that simultaneously reassured and irritated me. "Sir, why don't you start from the beginning?" the older one suggested after brief introductions. He had a patient, fatherly tone that probably worked wonders on scared teenagers and confused elderly folks. I told the story again, trying for more coherence this time. But the surreal nature of what I had experienced made it no less bizarre in the retelling. Their expressions ranged from politely interested to skeptical. Their glances at each other told me that they were chalking it up to fatigue, hallucination, or the creative influence of illicit substances. "We'll have a look into it, son," the officer finally promised, his tone ringing more of trying to pacify a delirious man than any real commitment to action. "Why don't you come along with us so you can show us where all of this happened?" he said. I nodded, then I got into the back of their cruiser, hoping beyond hope that I could make sense of the nightmare, that we could help the woman. As we drove back to the town, the dread that had simmered down began to bubble up once more. As the horizon started to lighten with the first rays of dawn, the cruiser pulled into the outskirts of the town. The absence of the radio's weird music was replaced with the officer's casual radio chatter, but it did nothing to alleviate the unease that crawled up my spine. The patrol car's tires crunched on the gravel of the gas station's parking lot. The station was now as desolate as the town. The attendant was nowhere in sight. A chill ran down my spine. The gas station pumps weren't functioning at all now. The store shelves were now completely empty, and even dustier. Several of the shelves were broken. We got back into the cruiser. "All right, run us through it again." The officer in the passenger seat, a younger guy with a mustache that looked like it was drawn on, turned to face me. His expression was a mix of patient skepticism and coffee-deprived irritation. I repeated my story, but it sounded even less believable to my own ears in the sobering light of day. The officers exchanged glances. "No detour's been marked out here for weeks, fella," the older officer finally said, his eyes on the rearview mirror. "And this town, it's been abandoned since the 80s. We've got no report of a missing woman either." To hammer in their point, they drove me through the deserted town. Dust and decay marked the empty buildings. "See, it's all abandoned." The younger one gestured to the ghostly vista. In the daylight, with the officers, the town wasn't scary. Well, not too scary. Maybe creepy, but nothing like last night. We reached the town's center. It was as deserted as the rest of the place. The skeletal remains of the old bandstand stood as a bleak monument to better times. A chill ran through me as I noticed a tattered banner hanging morosely across the square. Its sun-bleached threads flapped in the wind. I read its faded words, "Hollow Crest Summer Festival." "Well, that's, strange," Officer Mustache muttered. A sharp crow's call echoed in the distance, the sound unnervingly similar to human laughter. "Yeah, weird," the older officer murmured, his brows furrowing. We didn't linger. The patrol car left the town center, leaving the eerie banner swaying like a ghostly pendulum in our rearview mirror. Their confidence seemed to have cracked a little, a sureness in their demeanor replaced by a subtle unease. Not that they'd begun to believe me, but the banner had sown a seed of doubt. We headed back to the gas station where we had left my car. Upon reaching it, the older officer asked, a note of concern in his voice, "You gonna be okay, buddy?" I nodded, and I cleared my throat. Yeah, I'll be fine." It was a lie. But the last thing that I needed was them thinking that I had lost my marbles. I apologized and thanked them, then I headed for my car. They headed into the station. Back in my car, the world felt surreal. I questioned my own sanity, almost ready to believe that it had all been a bad dream. I mean, was it a hallucination? I cranked the car. The officers came out of the convenience store, coffees in hand. They waved at me, and I waved back. Then, Officer Mustache paused and sauntered over. I rolled down my window. "Hey, buddy, your front headlight's out. You better get that fixed, all right?" He said. Sure," I muttered, my voice barely more than a whisper. "I'll take care of it." He nodded. "Okay, you have a good day, sir," he said, then he walked away. "You too," I muttered. His words stirred something within me. The memory of a collision, a dark figure in the road. The reality of my ordeal snapped back into focus. When I had hit the robed figure, I had broken my headlight. The horror of the previous night now felt raw and real again. Gritting my teeth, I shifted into drive. With a deep breath, I headed home, leaving behind a nightmarish chapter of my life that felt both real and imagined. The only tangible evidence was my broken headlight. Now, this all happened a few weeks back. Was it all a figment of my overwrought imagination, or had I really stumbled into that nightmarish town? Well, my bill to replace the headlights says that it happened. And I didn't go to the cabin. For the remainder of my vacation, I just stuck around the house. Next year, maybe it's time to start vacationing at the beach.